good brothers. So I am absolutely happy to be here. And of course, I don't want to make this too formal because I think that we're in good hands and in good company with each other. And to your point, Reverend Dobson, I think that this issue is something that is very critical. As a matter of fact, I was just looking on the news and I did see where the CDC passed a moratorium relevant to housing and delaying eviction till the end of the year. So, uh, Reverend Dobson, you're our housing chair. I'm going to kind of let you give your input and take it from there, and then um, I'll follow your lead and I'll chime in and do a little bit of moderating, and we'll co-moderate together as we got the great senator right here in our company. We're gonna pick his brain for everything we can get. But you go ahead and take it away, Reverend Dobson.
Thank you, President Houston, and welcome again, Senator Street. And I wanted to, the Trump administration did request the CDC pass this rental eviction moratorium. Although there is some legal challenges with that, although there is some window dressing going on. So I wanted to know, Senator Street, have you heard any of the latest around this CDC moratorium?
So my understanding is that the CDC was using its authority to protect the health and welfare of people by to essentially say evictions would potentially contribute to the spread of COVID, and therefore people shouldn't be evicted. And I think that's really significant. It's a good thing. What I'm a little concerned about is that there is means testing for it, so it doesn't apply to everyone. You have to be within a certain income bracket, and I'm not really clear on what the income brackets are. And the second part of it is the debt, including interest, still accrues, and so without relief to allow people to long-term pay off this stuff, you've created a bigger cliff for people to fall off down in the future. And so, yes, it's a start. It's something I think was good. We certainly want to help our most vulnerable people and stop them from immediate danger. But I think it's insufficient to just push it off. And pardon me, as an elected official, think about it this way. I'm up for election, president's up for election, Congress up for election. It's easy for us politicians to push this off to the end of the year, which is 1 month past the election. The month of the elections in November. I think what we really need to do is be looking at passing the HEROES Act, which provides actual tangible relief for people. So we're not just delaying their getting evicted, but preventing their getting evicted. So I think it was a good step because we needed some time to work through even a passage of the HEROES Act. But that doesn't mean we should become satisfied and should stop pushing for us not to pass the HEROES Act. HEROES Act would actually provide relief to actually help bring people current on their mortgages and not just delay the inevitable, they're getting evicted.
Yeah, and thanks for the answer. And I was speaking with some other folks that are looking at this as well, and I believe there is no enforcement mechanism to that CDC bill as well, so that gives it really no teeth. The other question before I yield the floor to President Houston that I wanted to ask you is the current situation here in Pennsylvania, folks who are looking for rent relief. The Governor Wolf had a press conference yesterday around this issue. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening in Pennsylvania around evictions, whether there are money resources there from the CARES Act? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So there was money allocated to help folks pay off, to help before foreclosure prevention money, as well as renter relief money to help renters. So there's both money to stop mortgage foreclosures and renters. There are a couple challenges. One, while I think it's a great program in the way it was structured, unlikely that that the money we allocated is going to be enough to help everybody. So at some point that money is going to run out. Mm-hmm. Although I would suggest anyone who needs that relief to go after it now before it does. and unlike the just merely foreclosure delays, this actually would help bring folks current. That's the first thing. The second thing is that's important to note is the governor also pointed out that he had delayed and suspended all foreclosures and evictions, period, across the board, not means tested for all people. And he believes his ability to continue to extend that further has been exhausted. And so it will now take an act of the General Assembly, that's the Pennsylvania House, the Pennsylvania Senate, to give him that authority. And the Republicans, that my colleagues in the Republican Party who control the Pennsylvania House and Senate, have not yet shown an appetite to do that. But that's certain. The governor called on us in the General Assembly to make sure that we extended the moratorium on foreclosures and evictions. For instance, let's say you're a family with a firefighter and a school teacher. It is quite possible, but I think the president's thing is for people who are of limited means. And let's say you make firefighter making 75,000, school teacher making 60,000. You've been working for a while. You got 135,000 of income. You're still living paycheck to paycheck because you got 3, 4 kids, and you got a mortgage that ordinarily you can pay. You don't qualify for this. Now, firefighter, school teacher, both essential workers, are getting paid. Take those same incomes, right, and you make it a barber, right, and a realtor. A barber and a realtor both were completely shut down, where you were no barbering and there was no selling of real estate for months. That barber and that realtor could literally be, who might have 135,000 in income, they'd be in a position to be, they wouldn't be helped by the federal act because they make too much money, or they used to make too much money. On their last tax return, they made too much money, but now they don't make any money, and they would be in a position where they could have their home foreclosed on, or they could be evicted. And that's why it's important that the state legislature passed the moratorium on evictions and foreclosures that the state had, which was much more comprehensive than what the president has proposed. And again, that's not to suggest that what he proposed was bad, just that it was inadequate. It doesn't fix the problem for a whole lot of folk.
And thank you, Senator Street. I appreciate that. You broke that down pretty well. So as we're seeing in the national news today, Senator, that the CDC passed a moratorium, I guess, allowing people to stay into their respective homes or apartments or whatever, and that their rent won't come due till the end of the year. I believe the 2-person income can go as high as 168,000. I believe I had seen. One of the things, and actually I have questions for both of you because you both have a background with this, but one of the things that I'm finding incredibly interesting, Senator, and we're already in the Pennsylvania State Conference, NAACP, seeing people kind of panicking. But I did notice that the renter association, I believe I'm saying that correctly, they were vehemently opposed, Reverend Dobson as well, to this moratorium being issued. Their position is that basically people that own property have bills to pay as well. One of the things that I would like you to, if you both would elaborate on, is we know with COVID-19 and the impact of that with working individuals, how do you first, Senator Street, how do you see this playing out, particularly when we get to the end of the year and all things come due? And then Reverend Dobson, I'd like your input as well.
Well, there are 2 things. One, a slight technicality. So the rent still becomes due at the end of the month, but the mechanism for collecting in terms of putting you out, that is forestayed. The reason that's important is because interest and penalties can accrue. So let's say I owed $1,000 rent. If it didn't come due to the end of the year, that means in December, January 1, I owe $1,000. If, on the other hand, it became due at the end of October, sorry, the end of no, at the end of the beginning of October, because they were in September. That
Right.
means October 1, I owe $1,000. Then October 5th, because most people get 5 days grace period, I owe the penalty, which means it probably jumps to $1,100. And then after that, it begins to accrue at some interest rate. And let's say that's 5% per year or something like that. Then you take, that means by January, another quarter, so you're probably owe about $1,200. And then that's true of each month. So if over a course of 3 months, you basically owe a fourth month of rent. And so it is helpful, but not as helpful as people think. And I don't think people realized that because it is due, even if it is, even if the enforcement mechanism isn't there, interest and penalties can validly accrue on rent that is past due. Because every lease will say that the interest and penalties only accrue after the due date. So if you move the due date, then you would avoid interest and penalties. But by simply moving the enforcement mechanism, you don't preclude interest and penalties. And I think that's important. And Reverend, and I'm sorry, President Huston, I appreciate your correction. I was sort of estimating the income guidelines, so we want people to have accurate information. But even at 168, that means if you have two realtors, or who may have, or a realtor and a barber could easily, and I put them at 140 in my analogy, but a lot of them could easily be at 170. And that family at 170, they're not doing bad. As a matter of fact, in many cases, that's the backbone of what we would call the middle class in the Black community. But this devastates the middle class, because 168 divided by 2 is only 84,000 a person.
That's right.
That's decent money. That's good money, and makes you solidly middle class, but it don't make you rich. And most people who are making that kind of money have found a way that their lifestyle has grown to accommodate that. And unless they're going to move out of their house and get a small apartment and downsize their life immediately, they probably aren't in a position to they probably don't have a whole lot of savings to tap in, and they probably can't be extended too far. So I think the long-term implications are in January, we'll see a whole lot of folks get evicted. The other thing is, if you are a landlord who is dependent on using the rent money to pay your mortgage, then what will happen is your mortgage will become delinquent. You will go into foreclosure, because this is only forestalls evictions and not foreclosures. Even when the property is foreclosed on, you can't put the tenant out. But now the foreclosed on property, particularly if a tenant is month to month, which many people are because they've been in their leases for multiple years, then the foreclosed bank is probably just going to put you out anyway because your rent's behind. And now you're going to, once January comes, they're going to issue you a 30-day notice to get out. And in some places like Pennsylvania, you may be able to extend that to 90 days, and then you're out. And you have an eviction on your record, which makes it harder for you to rent someplace else. So, I mean, the consequences of not providing more comprehensive support are significant. That's why when we did our legislation at the state, we provided actual relief. So if the tenant got relief in the form of a payment that went to the landlord. So then the landlord would have gotten a form of relief, because then the landlord received that payment, be able to pay his mortgage. It helps keep the economy going, and it stabilizes families, both the landlord's family and the tenant's family.
Yeah, I will only add to piggyback off what Senator Street said. I think that's why it's important to pass legislation to really recognize the relief that landlords need in terms of a mortgage forbearance, and what renters need, a repayment plan because of back rent. I know California legislation just passed legislation. Governor Newsom signed the bill. New Jersey is currently working on legislation around that issue too. So I think this is going to be state by state. I think folks are going to be looking to look at legislation to make sure landlords are protected, as well as renters have some type of repayment plan and some type of eviction protection. So those are things that are happening. I think each state, and I think Pennsylvania, we really got to get some legislation passed to make sure that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe that Senator Muth, who is the Democratic chair of our Housing and Urban Development Committee, in the Senate is, I know we've circulated a letter talking about these issues, and I believe she along with, I'm on the committee and others, we're working on a Pennsylvania-based solution, which could come in the form of new legislation, doing some of the things you have. We're expanding funding for the existing programs. The problem is we are limited in how much money we have because at the state level, because unlike the feds, we can't print money. We have a limit. And we have to have a balanced budget. And we've already and right now we're projected to run a deficit. And unfortunately, again, the federal government didn't step up and hasn't provided the relief that's needed for states and local governments to move forward in this pandemic.
So, Senator Street, I know that on the 24th, Governor Wolf issued a letter to both the House and the Senate, asking the General Assembly to act and immediately fix the problem in Act 24 and to provide meaningful assistance to this vital sector of the economy and prevent displacement of Pennsylvania. Has that letter sent by the governor to the General Assembly, has it been addressed, considered, or where is it at? I know that, on the other side of the aisle, you have a very conservative wing in Pennsylvania in the Republican Party. But does it look like any traction is going anywhere with this?
Well, it's unclear to me whether the Senate Republicans are going to do anything with it. I haven't yet received notice that they are. I will say that we as Senate Democrats are taking, many of us, although we're not monolithic, but many of us are taking the governor's request very seriously. I certainly am. Believe that he has made good points, and there are things that I'm prepared to advance. But even if we write legislation, again, the Republicans will determine which bills are called up for a vote. So in theory, there could even be 26 votes in the Senate if you had all the Democrats and a handful of Republicans. But if the Republican leadership does not call it up for a vote, then we will not have an opportunity to pass it. So, and often the Republican leadership has a rule called, they won't call things up for a vote unless there's a majority of the majority, meaning that even if there are as many as 10 or 11 or 12 Republican senators and all the Democrats prepared to vote on something, which would be a supermajority of the Senate, they wouldn't call up for a vote unless they had with 29 Republicans, they would need 15 Republicans before it, and that is an awful high hill to climb, given the makeup and the composition of the Republican caucus. So I am optimistic that we have the votes to pass such legislation, but not optimistic that the Republican leadership would allow it to come to a vote. And for folks need to understand, I know, because getting into the procedural weeds, but in election year, people understand that's the difference between having a Democratic majority and a Republican majority. It's the values of what the leadership calls up for votes. And so if you are a person who is a small government, we don't want to spend money on anything because we believe people should go on their own person, then this Republican majority in the Senate is probably be something you'd like. But if you are, I am my brother's keeper type person, and that we realize that none of us are free unless all of us are free, and sort of a rising tide lifts all boats kind of person, then you would probably not be pleased with the decisions that are likely to come out of this leadership.
And I think you make an excellent point, Senator, because I think we do need to understand the procedural weeds. I think that we as a people being ignorant to that fact is something we no longer can have anymore. I think that if we want to understand how our government works, particularly on the state level, not to mention the federal level, we do need to understand those procedural weeds, because with this particular issue, this is not just going to impact urban communities. And I think there's this mindset, particular in some, legislator mind that, well, this is an urban issue. Most in the rural communities, they own their homes. But Senator, would you agree that's not necessarily true? right?
Absolutely. This is not necessarily true. There are many people in small town Pennsylvania and in rural Pennsylvania who are renting. There are people who rent family farms.
Mm,
And if they can't make the rent, then they can be evicted as well. There are a lot of folks in small town Pennsylvania who are, in fact, renters. We have a lot of small cities in Pennsylvania
mm-hmm,
that have renters, cities like Reading and Lancaster and
mm,
Harrisburg and
mm,
Erie, that are all impacted in the same way that Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, or Allentown would be, which are some of our consider our larger cities. So what I would suggest is this is an issue that cuts across big cities, small towns, rural areas, and urban areas. And I would say even more, it hits people who may not think of themselves as traditionally poor.
mm,
Because as I mentioned, you can have upper middle class people who are renting, who watch their upper middle class income go from, up from a couple 100,000 to zero pretty quickly. Because if you're a
mm,
realtor,
mm,
like I said, or you're a barber, or you own a restaurant, certain kinds of restaurants, or you have any number of businesses, you could be completely shut down, or have been shut down for a period of time, the duration of which, just cause you economic turmoil.
mm.
So I think a lot of folks need to understand that this impacts everybody, and it's good the NAACP is raising the issue.
Yes, and thank you, Senator. So, Reverend Dobson, we're both men of the cloth, particularly if you could give a perspective on how you see this from a spiritual perspective, impacting and affecting, and what can the churches do more or could potentially do, even though we're in COVID, we're not at our full strength of our congregations, particularly those that pastor larger congregations. But how do you see this whole housing component with the rent impacting those that attend your congregation or other congregations throughout the Commonwealth?
That's a great question, President Houston. My full-time pastor days are over, so I work mostly work mostly on the policy end. And I think what the faith community can do, and Senator Street, you can chime in too. And that's when I say faith community, I mean all faith community, and really start to educate their constituents, their congregants, of how important policy is when it comes to these issues around housing. We all know that, our conservative brothers and sisters, they weren't conservative when they instituted the GI Bill, when folks from the war were getting government assistance to build housing or to get housing in the suburbs. Blacks and Latinos were discriminated against that, and that was federal housing policy that allowed mortgages to create the suburbs, right? And so this is part of the Sunday school training that we had to talk to our congregations about. Like, these are policies that were instituted in this country that was based upon ideas around racial hierarchy. And we need to begin to teach that. We needed to teach about how important housing is a human right. And as Dr. King said, the rich get socialism and the poor get capitalism. So these are historical issues that many of our folks in Pennsylvania and throughout this country don't realize, that when they were getting mortgages, when their grandmothers and grandfathers was getting mortgages, the government was subsidizing those mortgages, and they weren't allowing Blacks and Latinos to get mortgages. And I'll stop after this, because I can go on all day about, we all live in subsidized housing. It's just narrated differently. For poor folks, they say this is subsidized housing that the government pays. But when you're a middle-class person, and to Senator Street's point, sometimes middle-class struggling, when you get your income tax credit, or you get your housing tax credit, that is subsidized housing. So when you get an FHA loan, President, do we call him President? I guess we can call him President Trump. Father made his wealth off of FHA loans. The wealth of this president was off the back of FHA loans. That's how he became wealthy.
That's right.
Government housing, subsidized housing, and how he became wealthy. So for us as faith leaders and as legislators, we need to teach this housing history to our country, so people know, even our conservative brothers and sisters who won't put bills up. The house that you're living in is a subsidized housing. The houses that your parents and grandparents lived in was subsidized housing. So let's not play this game to say you don't want to pass a bill for poor people when you yourself got benefits that others didn't get. So
yeah, I absolutely think those are great points, Reverend Dobson. But I would add to I would add to this that the challenges we saw around redlining, the challenges we saw around banks allowing for fair and equitable participation in the process are not just things of the past. But in fact, we know that African Americans, Black and brown folks, Latinos as well, are less likely to be approved for mortgage loans and less likely to approve for bank loans. And when the decision was made by the Trump administration to push all of the assistance for small businesses through the PPP program, through the banks, what we found was that 95% of African American businesses, I think similar numbers apply to Latinos, Black and brown businesses nationwide were rejected and did not get the PPP loans. So if you were a larger and white business who had was more likely to be approved by a bank, and you got the relief from the federal government, which could be used to maintain your employees and maintain your business, and then some of that allowed you to pay yourself or your staff, and then you were then able to pay your mortgage. You are less likely to be in mortgage foreclosure and less likely to be in less likely to be in eviction status, eviction eligible status, than people who did not get that support. And so the inequities we've seen historically in the banking community still exist. And as a consequence, regular folk who, if they had gotten those small business assistance from banks, wouldn't need the bailout, wouldn't need the assistance with respect to their personal housing. So the inequity, what we found is that COVID has magnified existing inequities, and it continues to do that. And this is no exception to the rule.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator Street. Senator Street, what specific action in your role as state senator have you taken in regards to proposing legislation that would specifically address the needs of individuals as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic? And I know that's kind of a tough question because I mean it's all encompassing, right? But yeah, if you could share that with.
So I'm going to preface by saying this is not this doesn't capture everything that I have been involved in, because we don't have enough time. I could just keep talking for the entire time, talk about all the things we've done that have COVID related. But I'm going to hit the high points for folks and try and maintain some level of brevity so we can continue the dialogue. But things that I worked on I was a part of the Senate Democratic Caucus's proposal to provide mortgage and rental housing assistance. Specifically, I worked very closely with Senator Haywood on ideas around making sure that people not only got that, but that had the ability to get assistance from legal assistance, from free legal assistance, because there were complex legal issues involved in all this. So we needed to make sure people could get lawyers, because the last thing you need to do is, hey, you can get assistance, but now you need a lawyer to help you, and you can't afford the lawyer because you ain't had no money to begin with, because you can't just pay your bills. So that was one part. The other part was we did a lot of talking about people needed to get that people were heroes, or people were, our first responders, and how much we loved them. Well, I worked closely with my caucus and House Democrats, as well as the governor. And ultimately, through our advocacy, we're able to work out a compromise where we got some hazard pay to workers. So if you were a nurse or a doctor or someone like that, or even a first responder in law enforcement, There's now an opportunity for those first responders to get additional hazard pay, and the governor announced that program a few weeks ago.
He did, yes.
And that was something. And then I did specific advocacy to institutions like Temple in my district to make sure that they availed themselves of that and got some of that money to folks. Another issue we worked on was the issue around reducing the density of people who were in prison because COVID could spread quickly through prisons. And this is an issue sometimes overlooked. But California was doing a good job in almost every regard to deal with COVID, but made some significant mistakes in how it treated and dealt with its prison population. And as a consequence, COVID spread like wildfire through California's correctional institution, which then leaked into the outside because people are coming into prisons to work. Those people go home and interact with other folks. And once you had a big outbreak in the prisons, that contributed to the entire state of California spiking. And so we have to understand those folks on the inside are interconnected with us on the outside. We needed to protect them from COVID because it was the morally right thing to do, but also it was the logistically and fiscally right thing to do. And when California was trying to do the right thing, made some mistakes, that exacerbated the situation. Another issue that's been really important is making sure, and I've talked with folks at the school district in Philadelphia, but also with the State Department of Ed about school districts across the Commonwealth, and also with folks at Comcast about making sure that if young people are going to be working virtually, that we increase access to the internet, because it'd be very difficult for you to go to school virtually if you don't have access to the internet. And so the school district in Philadelphia has purchased a number of laptops and tablets to get to young people, and are well on the way to making sure that folks have internet, although we're still not there. There's still people that don't have it, and so there's a lot of work to be done in that regard. And finally, we looked at I did a bunch of work, including physically carrying boxes to make sure that food was given out. We gave a ton of food to people who were in need. And many of those people who were in need, because we did not run background checks on people's income eligibility, many of those people were people who previously wouldn't have needed that food, but you could tell that their situation had changed. They were in line to get food. And we worked hard to make sure people had food, because that was incredibly important as well. And the final thing I'll talk about, we talked a little bit about the kids having internet access to remote learning, but we also worked and pushed to make sure that we did capital improvements to remove the lead and asbestos in the schools, because those cause respiratory issues. And we know that respiratory issues are in fact a comorbidity of COVID-19. And we need to make sure that happened. And I guess my penultimate thing I'll mention is we have worked on making sure people have the right to vote by mail, and that not be precluded. And as an officer in the Democratic Party, and also as a state senator, as a candidate this year, I intervened along with other legislators and party officials to protect the right to people to vote, early vote by mail, and have great access to doing that. For whatever reason, the president has consistently worked to try and reduce people's opportunity to vote. And he's certainly done that in Pennsylvania. I commend the NAACP for your efforts also in that litigation, because we all stand together in understanding that increased access to voting results in better laws and greater equity.
Absolutely. So those who question whether or not Senator Street is earning his keep, and this is by no means an endorsement, y'all. So those that are listening, state president endorsed Senator Street. No, but I mean, we need to give honor to whom honor is due. And you're hearing a senator that is actually out there doing the work and is having an impact on the issues that are affecting Black and brown people, which we in the NAACP absolutely advocate for. Reverend Dobson, if you would, as our housing chair, speak to what you would like to see our respective branches do more of, or in the housing issue, and what is impacting our constituents throughout the breadth of the Commonwealth. Speak to some of the branch presidents that may be listening, what you would like to see them do more of when it comes to the issue of housing.
Yeah, thank you, President Houston. Thank you for your leadership, and Senator Street. I think one of the things as the state conference housing chair, I would love for us to get more engaged in policy issues around housing. Meeting with, speaking with Senator Street, we definitely have a growing issue of poverty that's happening throughout the state of Pennsylvania. As you all know, Pennsylvania is still the leading industry in Pennsylvania is the agricultural business. So we need to make sure that our folks have access to jobs and housing. Again, housing is a human right, and we need to be educated around those continued redlining policies, practices that are still existing. If you have a housing chair in your branch and you see or you hear about redlining, that's an issue that we need to address. We need to let the senator know that that's going on. We had a meeting a week ago, and we talked about one of our housing chairs, mortgage company, Wells Fargo, if I can name it, because they are notorious. A week before closing, pulled the mortgage because there was a bounce check 2 years ago or something. That these are the type of practices that we need to be adhering to. These are redlining issues where these banks refuse to give mortgages to Black and brown folks, and they're using this practice to make sure that we don't have access. So our branches, our housing chairs, we need to be meeting and talking with our senators, talking with our legislators around what we're seeing in our communities, educating our folks around this history and present day redlining, criminal background checks. And I know Senator Street is working on the marijuana issue. Now, let me say this, because our branches need to educate our brothers and sisters. Listen, recreational marijuana is going to happen in this country soon. We're going the state by state route. But if our folks are not a part of this discussion about making sure there is access to licensing for Black folks, making sure there's access to growing, farming. Again, Pennsylvania is still, the agricultural business is still the biggest business in the state. If we're not educating our folks to be on top of these things, and then that's the economic loss for our people. These are the things that we need to be engaged in. And listen, marijuana was classified as a Schedule I drug back in the 30s. Prior to then, it was legal. Not only was it legal, it was used in most of our medicines. They racialized it and made it a racial issue because of the paper company. Hemp paper was much cheaper than wood. And so that's how that happened. So we need to educate our branches around housing policy as well as the economics, because the economics for us to buy and purchase housing is really, Black folks, we have always been entrepreneurs. It's always been business owners. And so when we have access to economics and access to housing, that's when we climb the upward mobility that's been robbed from us through federal housing policy for years. And it's been an issue, and we need our branches to appoint housing chairs, to meet with our local elected officials, our state senators, our state elected officials, to make sure they deal with the redlining that's still going on, and to make sure there's economic opportunities for us all.
Yeah,
thank you.
I think you made some excellent points. If I could jump in.
Sure.
You may, as you all probably are aware, I'm a prime sponsor of recreational marijuana legalization, a recreational marijuana legalization bill. I've been one of the Senate's leading proponents of moving towards legalization of recreational marijuana. There are a few reasons. One, and by the way, in the House, another African-American, Jake Wheatley, is one of the leading proponents. And Jake and I, while we have slightly different bills, we share some of the same motivation. First, I will point out that Black, brown, white, yellow people all use cannabis at roughly the same rates. But Black and brown folks are 4 to 5 times more likely in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to encounter law enforcement as a consequence of that use than white folks are. And 5 to 6 times more likely to encounter law enforcement nationally. So Pennsylvania beating the national average is still 4 to 5 times more discriminatory in terms of Black and brown folks encounters with law enforcement in the same areas as white folks. Secondly, it is a product that people routinely do not think of as being criminal to use, but we only treat it as criminal when we're referring to Black and brown folks. Referring to white folks, people laugh it off. Everything from white politicians to business CEOs joke about using cannabis in college or to relax on vacation. And none of them are ashamed, nor do they worry about any fear of retribution in terms of criminal prosecution. And I don't think they should be. I just think we shouldn't be either. The second thing I will point out is there is huge amounts of revenue to be had in the production and the legal production of and sale of cannabis, which the government could use that revenue. And third, I will say that that access to that should be the barriers to entry to cannabis should be low enough that a variety of people can get involved, including small business people and Black and brown folks. And so in the legislation, as I proposed it, it allows tiers of participation, including small tiers where folks can get involved and engaged in the industry who don't have a ton of money and can then grow their business to one day be competitive and be a big business. And also for folks who don't care about being in business, but who just want to use it for personal use, there is a home grow component. And so there are tiers of licenses, with the highest tiers for having the rigorous testing because they're selling to the public, and other tiers may be growing it and then selling it to businesses that test it before they sell to the public. And the final point that I'll make on the legislation, I think is so critical. We know because Black folks have been more likely to be, and brown folks have been more likely to have been prosecuted around this. We thought a part of the equitable justice involved should be that if we're going to legalize recreational adult use, we should also make sure that we seal the records of every person who has been convicted of a marijuana crime in Pennsylvania and release anyone who is being incarcerated. And those provisions are in the bill as well. So I think it's a real opportunity. I'm pleased that the governor has announced full-throated support for moving forward this year with the legalization of adult use of cannabis. And I think we got a good chance to get it done. And when we do, hopefully Black and brown folks will make some legal money and will be treated the same as everyone else in this process.
Excellent. Great point, Senator. Before we let you both go, Senator, if you could just touch on real quick on the socio and economic impact of how the legislature can play a role with access to the internet in a longer term perspective, because one of the things that we're getting a lot of, Senator, and I appreciate the question that was asked in the chat. We see a lot, particularly Black and brown people, who are struggling financially when it comes to internet access. And of course you have your cable and all that stuff, but what particularly can be done? And I'm not, this isn't any pun on Comcast, but let's just be honest. I mean, economically, it's hard for people to have, the access that they need. And I think the internet speed, right, as well. So what can the legislator, I don't know what the legislation can really do with that. Is there any regulatory issues, or how can we keep that cost down for our predominantly Black and brown people in our communities?
So there's a few things. Well, I think it's an excellent question, excellent point. I'll point out that Comcast, before I get into criticizing them, Comcast did step up and is working with the city of Philadelphia and the school district, as well as other school districts, to provide emergency internet access at either reduced or no cost to people who need it to access it for elementary schools. But the question was broader than that, which is internet access in a broad way, and how do we help kind of close the digital divide? So the Commonwealth can create programs whereby we help pay for internet for folks, and that is a way we can move forward. Local governments periodically have the renewal periods for license agreements for cable companies, and those license agreements, there's leverage that can be negotiated with cable companies. But to truly deal with the digital divide, the federal government, because internet communication is considered interstate commerce, the Congress would have to act, and the federal government would have to act to mandate that a certain level of internet be available to everyone, or the Congress could act to expressly give the states the power to regulate in this space, because the states are prohibited from regulating interstate commerce. This is clearly interstate commerce. And so we will be barred from regulating interstate commerce unless the Congress expressly provided it. And so I think that Congress should act. And I think there should be some provisions that if you're going to be if you're going to be a large internet provider, there should be certain provisions that need to be made for making sure that low-income folks have access to the internet. Moreover, if you are a poor person and you want to access the internet and you can't afford to buy it, a state couldn't mandate that they provide it, but the Congress could say that in order to be an internet provider, in order to have access to ISP or provide a pipeway through the web, that you have to have a provision in the same way that at the state level we can regulate the provisions of water or other necessities, and gas and heat and electricity. Those are all things that the Pennsylvania Utility Commission has the ability to regulate. This is considered interstate commerce. And so I would encourage Congress to act, the president to step up, and us to be able to provide mandates to allow regular folk, and this would tend to help Black and brown folks, but not just Black and brown folks, get internet access. Moreover, it's a big issue for rural people.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah,
Pennsylvania, and nationally, there are a lot of Black folks in rural areas, but in Pennsylvania, rural communities tend to be whiter, and those poor white rural communities have some of the worst access to the internet known to man. Some of them aren't built out at all, and the federal government should, in fact, mandate that they build out those areas. Every American should have access to the internet. It is a matter of public safety. It's a matter of being able to fully participate in the economy. And it is a space where rural white folks and urban Black folks have some commonality of interest in eliminating the digital divide. And one of the things it reminds me of is that when this president, because he has forgotten about poor people, he explicitly, intentionally forgets about Black poor folks, but he gives only lip service to helping poor white folks, because they didn't help them very much either. We need policy from Congress and the president in this space to help low-income people have access to something that in our new reality is a necessity. So I think Congress should act. If they don't want to make one sort of one size fits all process, then they could give power to state and local governments to act so that we can require a measure of internet be available to each and every person, because access to digital communication should be a right, not a privilege.
excellent. Thank you, Senator. And you really hit on some very great points, particularly about the rural areas. I know I'm located in the Pittsburgh region, west of the state, and it's absolutely incredible to me how many of the rural communities do not have internet access. Your Fayette County, your Westmoreland County, your Washington County, there's a lot of rural areas that do not have that internet access. and it's crazy. I mean, when you see it happening, you're just absolutely astounded that in these modern times, these rural communities do not have that. You know, Senator, you spoke about something, and so did you, Reverend Dobson, that uh, the issue of redlining. I know that there's a lot of people out there, particularly that's watching even this segment, that don't really understand the impact of redlining. And you do hear this president speak a lot about protecting the rural community. And making sure that we're going to protect your communities. And you heard the rhetoric about the suburban moms, right? We're going to protect your community. Um, if both of you can, and starting with you, Reverend Dobson, really talk about that red line, because I want everyone before we get off to understand what that really means. And in the NAACP, as the state president, I see that as a racist statement, and that's a racist attempt to stop African Americans or Latinos from moving into your more suburban communities. What explain to our listening audience and those that are out there what redlining really means? Reverend Dobson, if you could start, and then Senator Street, we'll close with you.
Yeah, so historically, banks would use color code maps in neighborhoods, and they would color code them based upon what town was too risky, what area was too risky, and what area was as prosperous you can lend. So redlining comes because they would use the color red to designate certain areas. Don't give mortgages there, which was historically African American, Latino communities, and the other colors were where you could lend. And so this is how the suburbs came about, because what happened when they were color coding the inner city areas, the government was also subsidizing federal money to build suburbs out in the suburban communities. So what happened when you have the cities, what was called white flight at the time, when during the 60s and the riots, folks were fleeing out to the suburbs. The Fair Housing Act created what was called affirmatively furthering fair housing, where these towns would have to market that these units, these housings were available. And so that's what the president is talking about, dismantling one of the key contributing things to the Fair Housing policy, the Fair Housing Act, was making sure towns was marketing to African Americans, Latinos, that there was housing available in the suburbs. So when you hear him talking about protecting the suburban moms, that's him really saying he don't want Black and brown folks to move into these suburbs. And so he's taking one of the key components of it, of the Fair Housing Act, and trying to dismantle it. And he's actually doing it, passing another bill that he's trying to do for transgender women as well. So he's doing everything he can to make sure the marginalized folks don't have access to housing, which, in the suburbs and the housing, in America, housing was the key way to accumulate wealth to move into the middle class. So if he can stop folks from building that wealth to buying housing and access and higher opportunity communities, he would do that. So that's what he's doing.
Senator?
I think that was an excellent synopsis, and I will say this quickly because I know we're fleeting on time. You're right. The Fair Housing Act was designed to protect suspect classes, Blacks and Latinos, from Asians, women, from discrimination. The president has consistently misconstrued what groups need to be protected. He believes he lives in a world where people are discriminated against because they're white and male and rich in his mind, and not because, or upper middle class, not because you're a woman or you're Black or you're a religious minority or you're a member of the LGBT community or you're poor. He actually, this is consistent with his ideology, that somehow people who are privileged and who live in, who are privileged and most likely white and who live in wealthy suburbs are the ones who are in need of protection in our society, when our very society has been structured to protect those folks. Meanwhile, he doesn't do anything to help and is working against helping poor Black and brown folks do better. He is taking his Justice Department and looking at preventing to make sure that we are not given any benefits. And he did the same thing in education. In higher education, he turned provisions that said we need to make sure there's no discrimination in education. And he said he was concerned that affirmative action was causing white folks and males not to be admitted to school, and that we should investigate any school that was in fact trying to affirmatively help Blacks, people of color, and minorities from getting in. Now he somehow thinks that people are not getting a house because they're straight. Now I'm a straight man. I'm a straight married man. Nobody is not renting to me because I'm a straight married man. They might not rent to me because I'm Black, but definitely being straight is an advantage over being gay, just like white is an advantage over being Black. And just like being born in this country is an advantage to me in getting a loan, being able to get a mortgage as being an immigrant. He has it all backwards. He's turned it all around, and I think it speaks. It is particularly pernicious because he has instructed the Justice Department that has historically helped the disenfranchised. He has instructed them to, in fact, work to make sure that the disenfranchised aren't getting help. And for Black and brown folks, that's us.
That's exactly right. Well, Senator Street, I want to personally thank you for what you are doing. I know we're going to have to get you back, man. This is an incredibly busy time for you, and we certainly recognize that. But I think that we definitely need to hear more from you. It's been very informative to me personally. Particularly with the housing issue, because what we have to understand, and you've put it quite eloquently, you both, you and Reverend Dobson, that housing is more than just a roof over your head. There's so many other areas of housing that plays into this for us as people of color. So I know for me, I've learned a lot tonight, and Reverend Dobson, I really appreciate you challenging us as the NAACP of the state of Pennsylvania and our respective branches to do more around the housing issues. I know here in the West, we're getting inundated in our local branches relevant to housing. Because people are terrified, Senator. They're calling us like crazy, especially when the moratorium ended. The phone lines went nuts because people were scared they're going to get thrown out in the street. So it hopefully, some things will happen in the government. And on the state level, I know you all are doing everything that you can. And I'm glad people got to hear directly from you how those procedures take place, because so often we're ignorant to what happens in the state government, right? We pay attention to the federal aspect, but we really don't pay enough attention to what's going on in the state and our local governments, and particularly in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania is very unique in its legislative body. One party can change the whole thing, and if they're not about equality, if they're not about fair housing and things of that nature, it can be a disastrous situation. Well, listen, I want to thank both of you very much for joining us tonight. Senator, again, we want to bring you back. And of course, Reverend Dobson, we're going to have you back. You both have been incredibly informative tonight. On behalf of the Pennsylvania State NAACP, Senator, we want to thank you very, very sincerely for taking the time out and really talking to us and educating us. And we look forward to having you back, sir.
Look forward to coming back. Thank you, guys.
Absolutely.
God bless.
Thank you. All right. God bless, Reverend. We'll talk soon, brother. Good to see you, man.